Good afternoon and welcome to Vote Chat. My name is Nicole Taber and I'll be your host for today's show. We are live streaming from the University of Otago's media production studio. Hopefully you have joined us on the live stream, because if so, there's the opportunity for you to get involved through Twitter. Critics Politics editor Caris Goodwin is covering the Twitter desk today, and here she is to tell you more about that.
Thanks, Nicole. I'll be live tweeting the conversation from today's interview. Those of you watching either as part of the studio audience or at home can get involved and ask questions by tweeting to @OUVoteChat or by using the hashtag VoteChat14. Then you can ask David questions throughout the show. Now, back to Nicole.
Thanks, Caris. We look forward to receiving your questions, so do get them through. Joining us today is Labour's Member of Parliament, David Clark. David is the electorate MP for Dunedin North and joins us here on Vote Chat. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Nicole. Good to be here.
So big news today is the leaders' debate. You caught it last night?
I did, yes. I watched it, delayed coverage, but I watched the whole thing.
What did you think?
Well, it was a clear points victory to David Cunliffe. The commentators are calling it that way. And the commentators are saying it wasn't the knockout blow, but certainly it was great to see David Cunliffe have unmediated access to an audience. So people could see him, not what the media was making of him, but could actually see him presenting as he is. And I think he won cleanly, and it was great to see.
What did you think was missing, perhaps issues and topics that weren't addressed?
We didn't see a lot on climate change. We didn't see the future of our planet's a pretty big issue. That wasn't covered in the debate. But the things that really are burning for people, jobs and so on, and the economy, were covered well in that first debate. So there's more to come.
So it hasn't always been politics for you. You were previously a Presbyterian minister in the church.
I still am, actually.
Oh, you still are?
Yep, they haven't thrown me out yet.
Right. So what is it that makes you go from the church to politics? Because it's not necessarily a conventional route.
Yes, no, I've come to politics via a very circuitous route. Originally trained as a minister of religion, worked in the University of Otago here, on and off whilst I was completing my studies, when I was doing my PhD. Also worked at the Treasury in Wellington and in a minister's office briefly to get a taste of politics, and running a student hall here on campus. So it's been a roundabout way of getting there. And for me, I guess it's about making a difference, which getting beyond that cliche is about being in a position to influence the shape of our society for the better longer term. And my last job running a student hall was more immediate. When you're able to help students find their way through difficult patches, it was very rewarding, and seeing them go on to be contributing members of society and leaders, terrifically rewarding. This is a little bit more at a distance. Sometimes you help constituents immediately, but a lot of it's actually about setting frameworks for the better of New Zealand. It does affect people in a very real way. You can look at minimum wages or other things that affects people's day-to-day lives, but it's taking that broader view.
And I understand you're originally from Auckland, so what prompted your shift down south? I
came down here, I had a year in Germany instead of finishing school in New Zealand, and then I came to Otago to study, and I fell in love with the place. I have tried to escape a couple of times. I've lived in Auckland, worked in a parish up there, also my time in Wellington working in Treasury, but it's a place that's drawn me back. This is, I think, my third or fourth time back in Dunedin, and I've spent most of my adult life here. If you add up the years, it's a great place, and I've settled now with a family, so it's where I call home.
And so you studied here? What were your studies?
Did first off a theology degree, first off a German degree, and then theology degree, and then later on a PhD, mainly focused on existentialist philosophy.
Brilliant. So let's take it now to some Labour policy. One of the areas that Labour is focusing on this election is work. So what is it that you're going to do to improve employment opportunities and job security for Kiwis?
Absolutely. We've said we'll get rid of the 90-day law as it stands. Having worked as an employer, I know how those processes work, and I believe in the principle of natural justice. If people are not performing their roles, they should be given an opportunity to rectify the situation, or at least an understanding of why they've lost their job. There is probationary periods in the law anyway. We don't think that 90-day stuff's necessary. We'll increase minimum wage, we've said that, and the last Labor government increased it $5 by the end of its term, lowest unemployment in the Western world. So we know that sustainable increases in the minimum wage can lead to a more productive economy. And we've got lots of initiatives around jobs. We've set up a $200 million regional development fund. The OECD says that the big opportunities for sustainable growth in Western economies lies in the regions. and used to talk a lot about agglomeration effects in the big cities, you know, the likes of Auckland and Christchurch. Now the OECD concentrates more on using the infrastructure where it is, which is in the regions, lifting skills in the lower skilled workforce and gaining, economic edge by doing that. And Labour Party policy tends to be evidence-based. We just have the challenge of selling it at that point. But so we've got a regional development fund of 200 million to partner with local initiatives for jobs. And then beyond that, we've made some Dunedin-specific promises. We're going to save Invermay, which costs nothing, but is actually in the wider benefit of New Zealand economically. The independent studies have shown that in their own internal reviews. We're going to breathe life into hillside workshops and the engineering cluster around it through investing government monies in Dunedin in that way. We think it's the public service, not the Wellington service. And we've also said that we will rebuild Dunedin Hospital and begin that upgrade. We'll commit to that, which is giving a great deal of confidence in the city. I have to say, Nicole, it's lovely to be a Labour MP in town this week after those announcements that David Cunliffe made, because people are taking me aside in the supermarket to shake my hand and introduce themselves. People in Dunedin need that confidence that the government wants to see a strong future for Dunedin.
But Labour are promising a lot to the regions. They're promising a lot to Dunedin. How high a priority is Dunedin on Labour's?
Well, it's a top priority. I mean, David Cunliffe has clearly said that he wants to see Dunedin recognised as one of the top 4 cities in New Zealand again, in a way that seems to have dropped off the radar. The opportunity is here for a high-tech future. We've got a skilled workforce here, an education at the heart of the city, great teaching hospital. We need to build on those strengths.
So you've mentioned there that the hospital needs updating. What are those updates that are needed?
The hospital as a whole, I mean, the operating theatres leak is point one, and actually some of the main rooms do too. It's a tired, crumbling building. Dunedin is the last of 4 major metropolitan centres in New Zealand to have a hospital upgrade. It's tired. The buildings are old, they're creaky, they require expensive maintenance, and that's sunk money, that's sunk cost that the DHB is carrying when it should be a national priority to make sure that we upgrade the hospital. It supplies a big portion of New Zealand's health workforce, and they need to be training in the best possible conditions so that New Zealand has a healthy, happy, well-trained workforce in the future.
And National have upgraded the emergency.
They've done something in the ICU, new intensive care unit, is the one thing they've done, really properly. It's a bit of a no-brainer. It needs to happen, but this government seems to be dillying and dallying on whether it will commit to it. There are rumours of a downgrade, and all of that stuff's undermining staff confidence in a DHB that is already cash-strapped. The funding formula doesn't seem to work for the South. It's got the biggest geographical area, but not the biggest rural adjuster, and that's got a number of historic factors. We've also said we will review the funding formula for health to make sure that health is properly funded in the South.
Also, this Tuesday, in the Otago Daily Times, you spoke of your concerns over the hours that nurses in the hospital work. So what needs to be done for these nurses? Well,
again, it comes back to funding the health system properly. The current government have not funded it below the real cost increase. They have funded it below the real cost increases. And that's meant that resources have become more and more stretched. People are being asked to work longer hours, and there's been an enormous number of nurses take sick leave. I think it's something like 90% in the last year, and there's a huge mental health component to that. People are being asked to do unreasonable things in highly stressful conditions, and that's not a sustainable position. And it's not just ED, by the way, it's across Dunedin Hospital. Staff are really stretched, and it's actually inhumane to expect people to do that. And what happens over time is people become tired and they make mistakes, and it's not good for the population either.
Now, locally, you have been advocating for the Invermay Centre for the jobs there. So what's the repercussions on Dunedin of Invermay downsizing? Well,
if Invermay downsizes, it's likely to be about 80-odd scientific jobs go, and there's a whole lot of support roles that go with that too. And so that's bad for the economy. It also has a flow-on effect to local businesses. The ag research restructure was designed to bring in business around agricultural research, right? That's the whole purpose of it. It says we need more clustering, we need more business hubs around it, and so on. And the internal review, which ag research did, which was mainly its own management with some staff representatives, looked at over 100 submissions, quite a few over 100, and they got the feedback. Nobody much likes change. change is difficult. But broadly, ag research or restructure makes sense. The one bit that doesn't is shifting the genomics capacity from Invermay up to Lincoln, because most of New Zealand's genomics capacity is based around Otago University and Invermay in partnership. And if bringing your research together for better partnership and having a successful business around it is your objective, you've already got that. Why would you get rid of it and start from scratch? It doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make any sense for New Zealand. And the productivity gains out of Invermay have been phenomenal. Sheep productivity has doubled in recent decades, and a big portion of that has been the science at Invermay. The scientists have said they won't move. That's the other problem. And why would they? A lot of their partners work at the university here. They won't find jobs in Lincoln that are comparable because it's the most research-intensive university in New Zealand. Otago and Lincoln's the least research-intensive, so their household incomes will likely halve in many cases, and land prices are more expensive. So it's a no-brainer for them. Lots of the scientists are already heading back overseas where they came from, because Invermay was world-class. They don't want to be a part of a second-rate institution, and others are searching about for jobs in New Zealand. So it's a net loss to New Zealand, to our exports, and it's also bad for Dunedin jobs as well.
And what other businesses in Dunedin are currently under threat?
Well, there's flow-on effects from that, right? So there's the name of the leading one in Dunedin escapes me right at this second. Abacus Bio, sorry, they're actually not doing too badly out of it because they're picking up some of the scientists out of Invermay right at the moment. But if you lose that research over time, you just have a slow downgrading of capacity, and that has knock-on effects. And there are other other businesses clustered around that, and we've seen it in the engineering sector, right? With hillside workshops being downscaled, the amount of engineering work coming here is lower. The surrounding subcontractors downscale, and that means they're not pitching for the big overseas contracts anymore because they're carrying a lower staff with less ability to carry out those overseas contracts. So the whole thing gears down. That's part of why we want to rebuild hillside workshops as well.
But you're small business spokesperson. Are you not concerned that raising the minimum wage, repealing that 90-day period, is just surely going to encourage people to look overseas for cheaper, more accessible labour?
Yeah, that's the National Party line, but it's not true. The fact is that economies that shift slowly and sustainably to higher minimum wages tend to do better. And I mean, Australia's the classic, right? They only need to work 4 days a week to earn the same income that we earn in 5 days. And they've done that by slowly increasing the minimum wage. That's part of the picture. Part of it's capital depth. If Muldoon hadn't got rid of Labor's savings scheme, we would have a couple of $100 billion in retirement savings. That was capital looking to invest in business. Instead, we've got people handing around baseball caps to family, friends and family. So you've got a picture where they've shifted. And when I had a bill to lift the minimum wage to $15 an hour, in my term as an MP, I was very lucky. I had 2 bills drawn out of ballot. That was the second one. It was voted down by the national government, who said they wanted to increase wages, interestingly. At the time it went through, I had a look at Australia, and they set their minimum wage by sector. At the time, in the worst paid sector, the minimum wage in Australia was equivalent to $19.50 New Zealand. The worst income you could earn was $19.50 an hour. Now, what happens in that kind of economy is that employers that want to get rich off cheap labour cannot. They don't survive. So jobs do go there. And what happens is employers who have a proposition that is world-class, that's a product that people want, pick up that talent. And so the good employers with good ideas and real talent pick up a bigger chunk of the workforce, and the economy as a whole succeeds. So, I mean, it's dynamic. Marketplaces and businesses are dynamic institutions. You do expect a bit of turnover. But what will happen is that your economy as a whole will be a hell of a lot better off if the minimum wage goes up sustainably over time.
Speaking of talent, in March this year you criticised the current government for restricting access to education. So what is it that Labour are going to do to open up access to education that the national government aren't?
Yes, well, we've said for starters that we will preserve the real value of education in New Zealand. So we will make sure that it was welcomed by Harleen Hayne here at Otago, because over time you'll know that the real value of funding to the education has diminished. allowing student and staff representation on governance boards makes sense. The universities can then decide who they take on. We're afraid that the government is wanting to have a controlling stake effectively in university governance, and that universities lose their critic and conscience role, which is part of which is about accessibility too. And generally undermining student allowances. In real terms, student allowances have steadily gone down the whole time they've been there. The last Labor government did a little bit. I mean, I wasn't a part of it, so I can't claim the credit, but for 9 years, every budget had an increase in student support in it. The National Government have had 6 budgets. The first 5, every budget had a cut in student support, 5 in a row. And the 6th one, in real terms, lowered the repayment threshold for student loan payments, so making it harder for students when they get out into the workforce. So, you know, Labor's about getting people into education, 9 in a row. National's about making it harder and making it accessible, sure, for those who've got deep pockets or their parents have. We don't believe that access to education should be restricted to those who've got parents with deep pockets.
Right, so will you change the criteria for obtaining a student allowance? We will.
We've said we will review the funding for student loans and allowances. We're going to have a full review. And you know, I was our associate tertiary education spokesperson for a while, and the intention there is to look at how you make it more sustainable. There's ample evidence that people on lower incomes are heavily debt averse, international evidence, and that they tend not to take on tertiary studies if they're going to incur a significant debt. One, it's practical. If they're the eldest child in a big family, their parents send them out to work because that family's on the breadline straight away. 2, they do have debt aversity. They tend to overestimate the costs of education and underestimate the benefits. People don't understand compounding interest. That's true across lower and higher socioeconomic people. And there's James Heckman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, says that for those people that are on those lowest incomes, it makes sense for the country as a whole to get them into the education system as far as they'll go, because not only do they and their families benefit, but also the economy as a whole gets a top up to GDP, because those people are producing better outputs than they otherwise would for the economy as a whole.
And for students thinking they would like to vote for you, what assurances can you give them regarding their student debt?
I can assure them that I will be fighting on the side of student support. I think people will know by now that I'm not afraid to speak my mind. I've certainly spoken out on the Invame issue fairly loudly, and I've also said some things which have been slightly controversial, that perhaps the Ministry of Science and Innovation should come to Otago and be sitting alongside the university. I'm prepared to stick my neck out a bit for students and make sure that we are actually looking after students, because I believe in it. It's actually about it is about access to education, and if we don't have a culture that says education is good for the whole of society, we're all losing out, and people then start to treat education as a private good. And you get people going through, you get it even now actually, when still the majority is state funded, people coming out saying, I've got a debt, I'm going to go and work in Remuera or Fendleton, I'm not going to go and work in Cannons Creek or Mangere. And that's because people are treating it more and more as a private good. I actually think we need to make sure that we hold on to education as something that is for the benefit of the whole of society.
And you're also bringing back funding for postgraduate students.
Yes, we are.
So can you tell us a little bit about that policy?
That's just to make sure that people can study postgraduate. We're also reversing the 7 EFTs policy, which would have I've got real people coming through my door, my electorate office, saying I've got most of the way through my medical degree, having done a previous degree, and now I don't know how I'm going to feed my family next year. I think I'm going to go back to my previous profession. And in some cases, the government may have invested $200,000 of taxpayers' money in that person. They've got a $100,000 debt themselves, and they're thinking of giving up because they had no way to feed their family. And it's just wrong. And I know that these 7 EFTs, all that cut that was put through by Stephen Joyce when National were in a corner and they wanted a distraction. He announced it, appeared before Select Committee shortly thereafter, and was unable to defend it, didn't understand the implications of it. They've stubbornly stuck to the policy, but it's got a whole lot of perverse outcomes, and we've said we'll sort them out.
Are you concerned, though, that you may create a culture of professional students that don't leave their studies and enter the workforce?
I think we've got beyond that, to be honest. There'll always be some exception that somebody can point to somewhere, but the general principle of people becoming more educated and contributing to society, it's a no-brainer.
Okay. So for parents out there with school-age children, what can you tell them about their children's education? What are you going to do there?
School-age children, we've said that we will give schools who stop taking donations from parents $100 per child per year. And principals I've spoken to are thrilled with that. That is a real, it's going to make a real difference for a lot of schools who struggle to get those school donations in from families that just can't afford them and their donations. But a lot of pressure is being put on families to pay over money they can't afford.
Why
for their
not just
students.
still accept the donations but also give them
Well,
$100?
in fact, schools that get over $100 per student, a lot of them will choose to continue to ask for donations. So it's optional. It's an opt-in system, and it's designed to reach where the greatest need is. And principals almost can't believe their ears. It's such a good policy. It's gone down so well.
Okay. Now, housing is a big issue for New Zealanders this election.
And for Dunedin.
Yeah. What does Labour propose we do to ensure that there is enough quality housing?
Yes, we want affordable housing. The market has failed to deliver affordable housing. The profits are much bigger at the top end of the market, and so that's where property developers have concentrated their energies. But where there's market failure, we've said that as a government, Labour is going to be much more hands-on. So we are going to go out and, in partnership with industry, build 100,000 affordable homes around the country. I think more importantly, in some ways for Dunedin, is our view that houses should not be cold and damp anymore. Rental accommodation should not be cold and damp. That has a cost socially, I mean, in sickness for families and so on, but it also has an economic cost for New Zealand that we all bear in the health system. And so we all as taxpayers pay for preventable illnesses, respiratory illnesses and other illnesses from people living in cold, damp homes. So we've said it's going to be illegal to let out a cold, damp home. The Labour Party is going to pass a law that says it's illegal to let out a cold, damp home, and that will have a social and economic benefit for New Zealand. Interestingly, the landlords associations are behind it. Which people may not have thought intuitively at first glance, but most of the responsible landlords have already insulated, and they're the ones that join those associations, and that's where the bulk of landlords are. There are still some rogue landlords, and there's been plenty of carrots for many years, and this is one of those issues, again, where we say the market isn't delivering. We expect food outlets to have a licence that meets certain standards, or they can't run a food outlet, a takeaway outlet in town. Where people are spending their money on a private purchase, certain standards are going to have to be met, and often it's government money flowing through at the moment to houses that create sick children.
And how are you going to measure cold, damp houses in Dunedin? How many would you say we have?
I don't know the number, but there's too many in Dunedin, I'll tell you that much still. But they will have to meet minimum standards for insulation and have a clean heating device in. It's not the cure-all. It's not there are other steps to be taken, but it seems like one of those lines that's quite easy to draw, to say that all houses should be reasonably insulated and have a clean heating device in them.
And Labour are building houses. How many of those are going to be here in Dunedin?
There won't be a great number in Dunedin, certainly not initially. Those houses are most in demand in places like Queenstown and Auckland, where you've got the big housing booms going on and the skyrocketing prices. Interestingly, the LVR restrictions have hurt Dunedin quite badly. People who are wanting to buy a first home, numbers of first home buyers have dropped back significantly, which is really trying to tackle an Auckland Christchurch problem. And we're saying, that those are the areas we need to start on.
So you've also proposed a capital gains tax on properties that are not the family home. Why are you doing this? Capital gains tax is something most Western countries have. New Zealand's a bit of an outlier in not having one. And it basically means there's a tax incentive for people to invest in property and, to speculate on the property market. Every dollar that you and I earn as wage or salary earners is taxed currently. But those who are super wealthy don't tend to pay much tax. We know, for example, that the majority of people who have net wealth of over 75 million are not on the top tax rate. So that means they're declaring income of less than $60,000. If you've got $75 million, it's quite hard to earn less than $60,000. Those people have complicated tax avoidance mechanisms, and a CGT is quite a progressive tax. The people at the very top do end up paying their fair share. And so we've said it's high time that New Zealand had one. But the main reason we're actually doing it is to level out the investment incentives. So, example I use is a plumber who's saved hard. Let's say it's a bloke who's saved hard all his life, and he's got 2 rental houses. Right now, he's in his latter years. He's trying to decide whether his final investment is going to be a 3rd rental house
or to invest in his mate's business who's developed an idea where you can read water flowing through a pipe without actually getting into the pipe. He's invented some kind of device, but he needs some investment in his business, some dyes, casts, some marketing and so on. He's looking for investment too. At the moment, it's a no-brainer for that plumber because there's a big tax break in the rental property. He's not going to invest in that productive business that will get exports for New Zealand. He's going to go for the tax break. It's a no-brainer. We think it should be a level playing field where he says, well, I've got a lot of practical expertise. I've got 2 rental properties. I know the business. I'm going to have to pay 15%. It's a little bit lower than I'll pay on most other things, but I'm going to have to pay some tax. Alternatively, if that business succeeds, there's a bigger return prospect. I'm going to have to pay tax on that too. Do I take the risk because it's got good returns and I'm paying tax on either? So it's going to tip and that's what happens overseas, right? That's why other countries have good manufacturing sectors where New Zealand's real manufacturing dropped 6% real last year.
But if we are in a housing crisis, don't we want investment in houses rather than his mate's business?
No, we do not want speculative investment. We want people buying their own homes. We don't want people buying and selling for profits.
Right, and with the capital gains tax and also the healthy homes warrant of fitness type scheme, is there not a concern that rents will ultimately go up?
No, if you believe in markets, at least you'll believe that a warrant of that the rents will rise up to what the market can pay. That's what markets tell us, and with more houses in the market, actually that should level off price increases.
All right, let's go to Twitter and see if there's anything happening over there.
So we've had a question emailed in about Labour's secondary tax policy. How will that positively affect people with multiple jobs?
Yeah, well, the secondary tax policy has been warmly received. At the moment, a lot of people who have multiple jobs pay a higher rate of tax initially. Now, in theory, at the end of the year, they can get that money back, but it's a timing benefit. So the families who are working 3 jobs are often living absolutely on the breadline. And paying too much tax first off means that they can't meet their week-to-week expenses. They may get involved with loan sharks if something goes wrong, if they have to get some private hospital care because of an injury that's stopping them working, or if they go onto ACC and their wages drop. I mean, I know a family in town where a woman had to move out of her house ultimately, but was supported over a period of time because she was on ACC, couldn't meet rent, had a teenage son in the house. People get themselves, when they're on the breadline, into difficult financial situations. That little bit more money that's evened out when you get rid of secondary tax and people agree a different tax rate through the year means that people can get by. And it's been a long concern for people with multiple jobs that they have to get by on less than they need week to week because they're charged more initially with tax like this. A lot of people too don't realise that they can claim that secondary tax, or they don't know how, or they have difficulties dealing with the IRD. The IRD are not always easy to deal with, and so some people miss out completely, and we don't think that's right. You know, that's money that people are entitled to keep, particularly those on low incomes who are struggling. They need it.
And how much extra will that roughly give people in their pocket each week?
It would depend entirely on what they're earning, right? And you know, it might be only a couple of thousand over a year that's extra taken, and you can spread that out over the time and see what that will be week to week. And for some it'll be less than that. But when you're on the breadline, that does make a difference. I mean, at the moment, somebody on the minimum wage who's working 40 hours a week and has a couple of kids at home spends half of their income putting healthy food on the table. That's before power prices and rent, and you know, it just doesn't add up. So those little changes will make a difference, in concert with, you know, putting the minimum wage up and so on.
And National have somewhat laughed at this policy, saying that that was their intention to do this anyway and that it's happening next year. How do you respond to that?
Oh, everything's happening next year with National.
Alrighty. So National have also announced that with KiwiSaver that Labour hope to make compulsory. Young couples wanting to buy their first home will be able to withdraw, I think it's 20,000.
Yep.
Do you think that's a good scheme?
It's going to have a huge inflationary effect, and it hasn't worked in Australia. And the Treasury here has pointed that out and said this is a stupid idea, effectively. So, you know, it's like putting petrol on a fire. You've got housing prices spiralling out of control. You're giving more people money to bid up the prices. And you've also got a lot of foreign speculators in the market as well. You know, that's certainly anecdotal evidence. We don't know because the government doesn't keep records of who's buying the houses. We want to start by keeping records of, let's actually see where the money's coming from and who's buying and selling in New Zealand. And that's relatively easy to do. The government just doesn't have the will to do it. And then let's have policies that actually address both supply and demand, rather than just heating up the market.
Looking here at Dunedin, alcohol is a problem for the city, and the DCC are proposing that we make a number of changes. I don't know if you're aware of them. We've got the 3 a.m. closing time for clubs, one-way door policy from 1 a.m. and no selling shots after 12 p.m. Do you think these are positive changes?
Look, I think they're band-aids. We do have an alcohol problem, there's no doubt, as a culture. You know, we as a society have long had this problem. Let's not pretend it's the students of today that have manufactured this problem. My generation were less aware of the harms, and you know, I always say, just because we did it doesn't make it right now, though, either. And you know, my generation might have solved world peace or something had we not spent our time down at the Guardies or the Cook. It's one of those things where we are learning more and more about the neuroscience, and we know that the front of the brain, where rational processes are developed, the ability to construct a logical argument and so on, is at its fastest developmental stage between about 18 and 21, when people are doing undergraduate degrees, coincidentally. We also know that that's the centre for addictions. So the main time in your life when you shouldn't drink, if you want to avoid being an addict, or take any kind of addictive substance, is between about 18 and 21, you know, which is not terribly convenient truth for students. But also, you know, actually it's longer than that. I'm contracting a little bit. It starts a bit earlier than that and runs a bit longer. Brain development goes till about 23. And if you've never had a drink in your life, and you go out and get rotten drunk when you're 26 for the first time, chances are you're going to have an awful hangover, but you probably won't develop an addiction. And so our understanding around the science has changed immensely in the past generation as to what's good and bad for people. And people are learning from that. You know, there are actually fewer people drinking heavily than when I was a student. That's what the science says. But some of them are drinking more, and women are drinking a lot more now too than they used to. And alcohol marketers are targeting that really directly. I think the big solutions lie, as the Law Commission laid out in its report, in price and marketing. You know, that's what the international evidence
Plain
says.
packaging, or?
Well, I don't know how you attack that best, but certainly taking away advertising that's focused on youth market, that's projecting images of people getting slimmer and more attractive when they drink. Those of us who've had a few drinks know that is not what happens when you drink. The reality is somewhat different. So misleading advertising, you know, clamping down on that kind of stuff and saying, actually, let people make their own choices. It's still about people making their own choices, but let's also look at the evidence around price. You know, heavy alcohol has become much more affordable than it was historically, and alcohol-fueled violence and so on has gone up almost exactly proportionately. I think we need a major reform of all our drug law.
Right. Now, Dunedin North contains a number of students, and so you're campaigning here for the electorate seat. You want to hold on to that. How are you going to be targeting the students this election?
I mean, one of the things is that I have an office that's really close to campus, and that's absolutely no accident. I think that students are a wee bit cynical when politicians turn up on campus in the 3 or 4 months before the election. I have regular clinics and have done so the whole time I've been in Parliament on campus. I make sure that I pop into OUSA, frequently. I have lunch in the Link. I've made it part of my routine since I got into Parliament. I mean, part of the reason I've spent so long at university, aside from the fact that I'm a slow learner, is that I actually enjoy this environment, and I made a deliberate attempt to come back and run a student hall, partly to be in this environment again. It's an exciting environment. People are constantly learning, and it's a big part of the electorate. So I've deliberately put my office close to campus and continue that engagement. I will be, like others, out there with a megaphone or whatever in weeks to come around Studentville, because I also think that in the campaign period there's an opportunity for those that haven't met you, that have burning questions, to come and ask them. I'm certainly making myself available, but I think the important thing is actually being available all the time to the students on campus.
And this year there's a unique opportunity with the election falling in September. The students will be on campus. Yep. And students historically are bad voters. They don't get out of bed and go to the polling booths. So how are you hoping to turn that around? Every effort in that regard is great. I'm thrilled that
the Critic this year with OUSA have got a studentvote.co.nz site that they're setting up that will actually make sure that students can get better informed. Personally, being out and about on campus, we've been enrolling people, all of that stuff makes a difference. Getting into the halls or around the halls makes a difference, and so on. It's part of a worldwide trend, and I think part of it too is that a lot of politics is geared toward the middle classes, the middle-aged folk, where the consumer dollars are, where the advertising revenue is. And so if you want to reach students, you've got to be deliberate about it. The Critic here on campus, Radio 1 and so on, are looking to appeal to a student audience, and they have been more politically engaged this year, and I congratulate them on that. That's been terrific. Because if you read the pages of mainstream newspapers across New Zealand, somewhat better in Otago, I might say, actually, but across New Zealand, they are focused on people who buy their newspapers, who tend to be older, who tend to be baby boomers, who tend to be buying the products that are advertised in them. And if you want student-focused analysis, you've actually got to look to student sources. And my experience is that people on campus are more worried about sustainability, environmental issues than the general public, because they're going to be the ones dealing with them in years to come when those of us who are in previous generations are going to be long gone. They're interested in education issues because they're right there and now, but they're also interested in the future prospects of the country. So it's a nuanced blend. And you're going to get a different kind of article written in a student publication than you will in a mainstream paper. So I'm trying to make sure, of course, that I'm as in touch with, as I can be, with those audiences.
And how are you planning to reach the wider Dunedin North community?
I'm out there doing street corner meetings. That's something that we do in election year. I door knock religiously anyway, right through the year, and have done the first 18 months in Parliament. I sent a letter to at least half of the houses in the electorate, over 9,000 households, telling them I would be in their suburb this weekend knocking on doors, and that if they wanted me to knock
so they know to hide.
on their, yes, absolutely. If they don't want to see me hide, if they do, if they want to make sure that I come to their door, they should be in touch with me with a contact address and so on. So I've been really deliberate about making sure over the whole cycle, because I think as the election gets closer, there are people with burning questions. You have to avail yourself to them, but people are suspicious when people just turn up at election year. So for me, it's about being in contact all the time and available.
Now, Labour are continuing to slip in the polls, despite we've had the dirty politics scandal and some policy announcements from you. So what do you think's going on here? Some
of the polls are up and down. There was one the other night on TV that had the balance of power sitting with New Zealand First. This is 2 days ago.
Still under 30%.
So, that would be higher than last election. But the point being, the polls are not where we want them to be. And I think that will change. People have been pleasantly surprised by David Cunliffe's performance, I think, last night in the first leaders debate, where the commentators are calling it a win for Labour. And I think he outperformed John Key, who looked flat, who looked like he thought he was above it all, and perhaps a touch of arrogance slipping in, but complacent. And so that will have an effect. I have no doubt that will have an effect. And it's actually about having a coalition as well. We're in an MMP environment, and people forget that last time it was very close too. And whether Labour wins or lose will depend on whether we get people out to vote. Last time, there was a huge number of people that didn't vote, 800,000 odd registered voters, who could have had a say, who did not. And that, if they were all Labour voters, it would have been an absolute landslide for Labour. They're not all Labour voters, but a portion of them are. And we know that, legislation has ground to a halt in Parliament since John Banks was convicted of fraud, who was supporting the government right through. Legislation ground to a halt. The smoko break legislation, where National wanted to get rid of smoko breaks, has stopped in its tracks because John Banks wasn't there to prop it up. So, when that kind of corruption goes from Parliament, National are holding on by a sliver, and it will be that close again, and it could go either way. So the real thing we're telling people is, party vote Labour, so there is a strong Labour presence to negotiate a stable coalition. We need a strong presence to be that leader in that coalition, and also that people need to get out and vote, because if they don't, it'll slip back into National again. But if they do, it's a very winnable election.
The get out and vote message has been pushed quite a lot by the internet parties. So what do you think about the emergence of them?
Well, I really admire the way they're engaging with a section of the community that hasn't been engaged with. All power to them on that, absolutely. They They'll be pushing hard to get some MPs into Parliament. We're still fighting strongly up north to win that seat. Kelvin Davis is an incredible performer and a real advocate on domestic violence issues and other Māori issues. He's an impressive MP. I'd love to see him in Parliament. But we'll see what happens on the day, I guess.
What do you think about them using the Māori seats to get in?
Well, you know, people get in however they can. They make MMP work for them. We've said, unlike National, we're not going to do any deals before the election. We're there to see what the voters want, and then we'll work with what we're offered at the end of it. David Cunliffe's ruled out having the Internet Mana people in Cabinet. He's been clear he'll take support but not give them a place at the Cabinet table. So some things are clear, but by and large we're saying the voters will dictate the shape of Parliament. That's MMP, and it's their right. We're not doing the kind of teacup deals in Epsom or whatever, the secret nods and handshakes with Peter Dunn. We're being upfront with voters.
Now, personally, you experienced great success with your Mondaysing bill. So that sets aside additional public holidays for days that would traditionally fall on a Waitangi Day or an Anzac Day.
Not quite. It's pretty close.
Okay.
It sets, unless I'm mishearing you, what it does is the Anzac and Waitangi will still be commemorated on the same day, on the same date. But a holiday will be set aside subsequently on the following Monday when they fall on a weekend. And that means that in those years where they fall on a weekend, we still get the same number of public holidays. We get very few public holidays and people look forward to them. So that means that we have space through the year, the same number of public holidays every year, not just 5 out of 7 years.
Right, and that'll take effect next year?
Yes,
Is that,
yes it will. So it's exciting. I guess I'm quite lucky. It was drawn out on my first day of Parliament. And people were lining up to punch me on the arm. People like Annette King, who's never had a members' bill drawn despite being in Parliament since the early 80s. But when I had my second bill drawn out, they were all lining up to have me buy their lotto tickets, I have to say. But, you know, I was very lucky. It's the only bill to pass against the government voted along party lines in 6 years. So, but it was hard work too. I had to negotiate support from the government support parties. And the Māori Party, came on board. They didn't want to be the party that voted against a holiday for Waitangi Day. Peter Dunn had said it was always a part of his policy. And I had to negotiate carefully to ensure that support. New Zealand First got in behind it, as did the Greens, so and Mana. So I was very glad to form that coalition and get something through Parliament that's changed something forever for New Zealand. So
you've managed to make a difference from the opposition benches.
Yeah.
Over the next 3 years, what issues are you going to be championing?
Well, the main reason, one of my biggest drivers for getting into Parliament was my concern about the growing gap between the wealthiest New Zealanders and the rest of us. And so I want to make a difference in that regard. I make no secret of the fact that I would like to be in a cabinet because I think that is where the really big levers get pulled. I'm open to whatever position or responsibility I have a wide range. I've been associate health, associate tertiary, tax, small business. What other portfolios? Finance. I've had a range of portfolios so far. I probably have a short attention span. I'm happy to turn my mind to something new, but particularly I do think health and education are areas where I'd like to be involved. I think there's huge changes needed in the health sector to make sure that public health is prioritised, and there are real opportunities in tax as well to make sure that we collect the fair amount of tax from everybody so that we actually have the resources we need to purchase as a society those things we all need but can't afford: roads, hospitals, schools, the basics.
All right, that does bring us to the end of today's show. So thank you very much for joining us, David.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be here, Nicole.
So that was David Clark. I'd like to thank researcher Rachel Carruthers for her contribution to today's show, and also the Department of Politics and the Communications Department for their ongoing support. There is no Vote Chat show next week. However, you can join us on a backbenches style show on the 8th of September. It's a Monday. Then, that Friday, the 12th of September, we will have a double show. We have Materia Turai coming on, that'll be at 1 p.m, and 3 p.m, we have David Parker and Liz Craig being interviewed by Peter Grace. We'll keep you updated on all of that on our Facebook and Twitter pages, but for now, it is goodbye. My name's Nicole Taber, and I thank you for watching Vote Chat.